What Raven would have.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Will. To me, my X-Men fans, in today's video, we're gonna talk about a character who is a dark and terrifying reflection of one of the founding members of the X-Men. In today's video, we're gonna go over the facts about Dark Beast. Let's get to it.
They say you either die a hero or live long enough to become a villain. In the annals of Marvel Comics' long and storied history, there are some of the most iconic villains to have ever been created regardless of medium and time, in my opinion. However, when you think of a villain from Marvel, you don't really think about Hank McCoy, the X-Man who is also known as Beast. But what if I were to tell you that he is indeed one of the most notorious villains of all time? Allow me to introduce you to Dr. Henry Hank Philip McCoy of Earth-295, one of the most notorious mad scientist and murderer in all of Marvel. Created by Scott Lobdell, Mark Waid, Roger Cruz, and Steve Epting, this Dark Beast would make his first appearance in X-Men Alpha #1 in 1995, which also served as the kickoff issue for Marvel's legendary Age of Apocalypse saga. This alternate version of Beast truly lives up to his moniker, and then some, as he is total terror committing heinous crimes on both mutants and humans alike in his sick and twisted pursuit of sadistic pleasures, which he disguises as a hunt for knowledge. In this video today, you will truly come face to face with the Beast himself and see how the smallest twist in history can transform one of the most learned and empathetic characters into a cold-blooded and sick maniac. So please join me as we learn how Hank McCoy changed from a man to a beast and then into a monster. Who is the man behind the monster? To understand who the man underneath all that rage and madness is, I think it's imperative to understand the environment that shaped him. Earth-295, which is the designation given to the alternate timeline where the Age of Apocalypse takes place, is as brutal and dystopian as it can get. Following the death of Charles Xavier after his son Legion traveled back in time to kill Eric Lensher, aka Magneto, but accidentally killed Xavier himself, Apocalypse chooses this pivotal moment in history to finally launch an all-out attack on North America. Without Xavier, Magneto forms the X-Men to oppose Apocalypse's rule. Naturally, since the timeline has been altered to such a great degree, so too have the lives of the people living in it. But I think most people would agree when I say nowhere has these changes been felt as much as it has been in the case of Hank McCoy's life. Despite being called Beast, Hank McCoy is a brilliant and empathetic mind who is one of the founding members of the original X-Men team. However, due to the death of Charles Xavier, in this timeline, Hank McCoy never really had the guiding hand of his mentor to steady his moral compass. This, along with being forced to grow up in a world created by Apocalypse where there is no room for things like empathy and love if one wants to survive, resulted in his personality getting twisted so heavily from the mutant that most people know and love. This version of Hank McCoy is an evil sadist who will stop at nothing to satisfy his ego in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. It is honestly frightening to see the usually mild-mannered superhero acting like an absolute maniac, torturing other mutants and humans, while viewing them as little more than livestock. Noticing his ruthless streak and genius, Apocalypse places him under the mentorship of Mr. Sinister, and eventually becomes one of Apocalypse's leading geneticists in the breeding pens. Trust me, if the name gave you the creeps, it should, because it's exactly what it sounds like. A torture house where cruel eugenics programs, genetic splicing, and mutagen experiments were conducted on the so-called weaker mutants and inferior humans. Due to his coarse gray fur and cruel ways, he would soon earn the moniker Dark Beast. But in truth, I feel like he was less of a beast and more of a monster. What does his body actually look like? The Dark Beast, as his name suggests, actually resembles his Earth-616 counterpart quite accurately, except for a few noticeable details. I, for one, can't see much difference between the two just at a single glance, as he has the same physical baseline that seems to be very similar to an ape's frame. The Dark Beast has the same muscular build, with sharp fangs, elongated ears, and claws on his hands and feet. However, as he continues to experiment on himself, these features change a lot over time. In my personal opinion, the most immediate thing you will notice about this version of the Beast is that he looks far more feral in nature, as his mane is much more longer and unkempt, and in certain depictions, so are his claws and fangs, which appear sharper and longer as well. The most distinct feature of his, however, has to be the color of his fur, which is an almost ashen gray in color, vastly different from the indigo coat of Hank McCoy from Earth-616. This variation in his fur color, as you will find out later in this video, plays a much more important role than just a cosmetic one. Let me put it this way. The Dark Beast looks much more sinister compared to the original, but outside of that, at the end of the day, he is still very much the same character, at least in appearance, initially before his experiments take a toll on him. How far did the self-experimentation go? I need you to understand that for a man who was as obsessed with science as Hank McCoy of Earth-295, his test subjects, or shall I say victims, were hardly enough to satisfy his dark lust for knowledge. Just like any maniac, at some point, his twisted and obsessive pursuits would lead him to turn the scalpel on his own skin, and that is what happens exactly. Unlike his counterpart from Earth-616, who viewed his transformation with caution and sought to understand and control it, the Dark Beast treated his own body like a petri dish. As his notoriety grew among his victims who whispered his name in fear, I feel that his need to live up to his own grand reputation began to edge him towards experimenting upon himself. He needed to match the horror he inspired in his victims, externally through his form as well, and before he knew it, he was hooked to the mutagens and the procedures, and you'll see how that affects him later on in the video as well. Through his character, I think we can easily tell a cautionary tale regarding the dangers of substance abuse to the younger audience, who will come across his character. Here is a flawed genius, who did terrible but great things, yet despite all the brains in the world, he couldn't escape the struggle of pumping himself with drugs and mutagens because he was trying to live up to an image of himself that he had constructed based on the perception of others. I mean, looking at his character in this way, Dark Beast is kind of a tragic figure, isn't he? Genetic splicing wasn't just research for him at this point. It was more akin to a physical and mental craving. If a new trait existed, like maybe an enhanced sensory organ, sharper claws, thicker muscles, he wanted it, leading him to immediately begin self-experimenting. He had altered himself so much that I don't think we can even tell at this point whether Hank McCoy even exists within him. What can he actually do with that genius and body? I know that there are several comic book characters out there who have the lethal combination of having both high-level brains and the brawn, but very few of them come close to replicating the things that the Dark Beast has been able to accomplish. On Earth-295, the Dark Beast, unfettered by notions of moral culpability, as I mentioned earlier, has fully redirected his entire being to the pursuit of eugenics and biosynthesis. And out of all the experiments he has conducted both on his victims and on himself, his darkest achievement has to be what he managed to do with Jamie Madrox, the Multiple Man. For those of you who don't know, Jamie Madrox, just like his name suggests, is able to create multiple duplicates of himself who are all flesh and blood, capable of independent thinking. What Beast does is by genetically manipulating Madrox and also using brainwashing techniques, he is able to force the Multiple Man to replicate an endless number of duplicates on demand to create the fanatical Madri. This separate infinite army came from genetic materials harvested from captive mutants and humans. Dark Beast completely dehumanizes his fellow mutant and turns him into just a factory of sorts, stripping away any form of dignity Madrox had, in what I feel is one of the most disturbing acts he has done. Remember the thousands of mutants and humans who were considered too weak and sent to him for experimentation by his master? Let me tell you, their fate is even worse. These individuals were forced to undergo inhumane experiments involving cybernetic augmentations, brainwashing, and chemical-induced mutations to construct cheap, disposable shock troops for his master at an industrial scale, ironically named the Infinites. I believe that this act highlights how the Dark Beast really doesn't see his victims as human beings, but as mere raw material from where he can harvest muscle tissues and organ systems to bend and shape to his will. Speaking of bending and shaping to his will, his next experiment is even more heinous as he managed to capture 4 superpowered siblings and fuse their DNA into a single grotesque monstrosity possessing all their abilities. Aiding him to accomplish all these with precise dexterity and control, while also subjugating the highly unwilling victims, is his own brawn. The Beast is his own enforcer, and thanks to his monstrous strength, there are few who are able to resist him violating them. How did he wear another man's face? Like I told you earlier, the Dark Beast was an extremely popular character among fans during the Age of Apocalypse saga. So when that story arc came to a close, Marvel needed a way to keep him around, and so they brought him over to the main Earth-616 continuity. I believe it was in X-Men Unlimited issue number 10, where Dark Beast ambushes the real Hank McCoy, overpowers him, and drags him into an abandoned facility belonging to the Brand Corporation, the same company where our Beast had originally mutated himself. However, instead of killing our Beast, Dark Beast does something far more insidious and sinister. He walls McCoy up behind a solid brick barrier, leaving him trapped in darkness as he steals his identity. However, despite looking similar, I've already highlighted the difference in the color of their fur, not to mention the behavioral quirks that the Beast had developed over the years. To disguise his appearance was fairly simple. The Dark Beast turned to chemical bleaching to transform his coarse gray coat to Hank's signature blue. He also filed down his claws and sheared down his mane in an attempt to replicate the far more civilized look of this world's Beast. This constant use of chemicals and going against his own wild features was a torment that the Dark Beast endured all too willingly to blend in. However, this was the extent to which he inflicted torment on himself. The rest of his ploy to steal Beast's life involved the suffering of others. He goes on to track down Hank's old parish priest and elementary school principal, two key figures from Hank's formative years, and murders them in cold blood to quell any chances of people probing about his early days. I feel that he does this so that no nostalgic conversations could trip up his performance. Not satisfied with just that, he then moves to Illinois, where Edna and Norton McCoy, Hank's parents, live in order to murder them and tie up any loose ends to his farce. However, when he arrives at the McCoys, standing in the quiet warmth of their home, Dark Beast is reminded of a time in his life that he had long forgotten. Due to this, he is ultimately unable to bring himself to kill Hank's parents. I still don't think it exonerates him from all the horror he inflicts upon the Beast in his quest to steal another man's face. However, for a brief moment, for what it was worth, we finally got to see that there was still a man within the monster. What did the Dark X-Men years do to him? The Dark Reign era is arguably one of my favorite times in Marvel Comics, and it gave the Dark Beast something he hadn't enjoyed since the Age of Apocalypse, which was state-sanctioned backing and unlimited resources. For those of you who don't know what the Dark Reign era is, it was a period of time from 2008 to 2010 when Marvel was exploring the aftermath of the Secret Invasion event, during which Norman Osborn had publicly killed the Skrull Queen Varank on national TV, making him a national hero. Using this newfound status, Osborn manipulated the US government into giving him total control over national security, including S.H.I.E.L.D. Let me tell you, what he does next is absolutely bonkers, as he disbands S.H.I.E.L.D. and replaces it with his own corrupt agency, Hammer. He then locks out Tony Stark from his own armor and rebrands himself as the Iron Patriot before recruiting villains to dress up as classic heroes. Such examples include Bullseye as Hawkeye and Venom as Spider-Man, to form his own Dark Avengers. I think you can see where the Dark Beast fits into all of this, because Norman also creates his own Dark X-Men, and the Dark Beast slips into the role tailor-made for him. During this era, the Dark Beast goes from hiding in sewers to running high-tech state laboratories, loving the authoritarian rule of Osborn, which I don't think is a surprise for anyone, if you've been watching this video closely. His crowning achievement during this era has to be the creation of the Omega Machine. Within the confines of Alcatraz, the device was designed to siphon away mutant bioenergy and suppress the X gene to fuel the weapon Omega. This siphoning off of the mutant bioenergy is not done painlessly. In fact, it is horrible for the victim to endure and is nothing short of torture, which is why the 616 Hank McCoy is strapped to it and forced to endure months of torture by his evil counterpart, before being rescued by the real X-Men. Until Osborn's eventual downfall, the Dark Beast served as the Green Goblin's resident mad scientist and enforcer, a role which I think we can say he was all too qualified and experienced to take on. Why does his design keep getting reinterpreted? While I think many people would assume that there must be some deep and unfathomable mystery behind the reason why the Dark Beast's character design keeps getting reinterpreted, the reality is much more grounded. First of all, I believe if you are familiar with how comic book works, a single artist never works on a character of a project their whole life. What this does is, just like how writers retcon and reinterpret certain story beats of a character, the artists too take creative liberty to an extent, resulting in varied character designs over the course of the character's history. I feel that the artists began exaggerating his posture and facial expressions in order to highlight his sadistic nature visually by giving him sharper teeth, predatory eyes, and feral postures, moving him way past his baseline depiction. This was obviously to highlight the similarities between the two, at least externally, during the early days. However, as you and I both know by this point in the video, the guy couldn't stop experimenting on himself, which brought about a lot of subtle changes to his appearance in due course. For instance, while retaining the musculature of an ape, the Dark Beast did begin to develop certain feline traits, like a squared snout, slit pupils, and cat-like ears. Since this self-experimentation is a core part of the Dark Beast's character, only time will tell how his character's design will continue to be reinterpreted in the future. What happened when his body finally gave out? The problem with abusing any form of substance, whether it's to give you a high or sharper fangs, I believe that it's an undisputed fact that their usage eventually takes a toll on the body, even if you possess a superhuman constitution like Dark Beast. In Uncanny X-Men Volume 3, issue number 22 from 2014, this cumulative toll of decades of uncontrolled volatile self-experimentation finally reached its tipping point for him. All this happens even as he attacks Cyclops' renegade X-Men at the new Charles Xavier School. I believe his entire cellular structure collapses from the inside out, which is mainly attributed to his years of injecting mutagenics, altering his own genetic code, and forcing secondary mutations, all of which have been silently taking a toll on his body and its stability. There is no grand showdown where he goes down in a blaze of glory. There is nothing spectacular about his death, which, considering the Dark Beast's ego and hubris, is oddly satisfying to witness. While it is true that his life support suit was ruptured and he triggered the explosion that apparently killed him, the truth is, he was barely alive at that point, in the traditional sense. What I found ironic is that a character who spent the better half of his life tormenting others and treating them as disposable lab rats for his experiments ultimately becomes his own final victim. What's the wildest physical transformation in his whole history? Following his death after Cyclops puts him out of his misery, Dark Beast, like all good popular comic book characters, refuses to stay dead and makes what I can only call an unexpected return during Secret Warriors, Volume 2, Issue number 3. Not only is he alive, he appears physically restored, with Marvel initially offering no explanation. I remembered being confused by this for quite some time because Marvel purposely refused to elaborate on this miraculous resurrection. The last I checked, Dark Beast didn't really possess a healing factor at the same level as Wolverine or Deadpool. My questions, however, would finally be answered in Uncanny X-Men Volume 5, Issue number 13, when it's revealed that Sinister had actually rescued McCoy's severed head after his previous death and grafted it into a whole new heavy-duty technological body. However, I guess the guy has a serious issue with getting his head removed from his body, because in Uncanny X-Men Volume 5, Issue number 20, he is once again brutally decapitated by magic, apparently killing him. However, Dark Beast proves to be as tenacious as a cockroach, and he refuses to die once again. But this time around, his fate is far more pathetic and morbid. You see, as it's revealed in Immortal X-Men Issue number 9, it seems that Sinister didn't really bother giving him a new body this time around. In what I can only describe as an act of ultimate indignity for someone like Dark Beast, his fully conscious head was kept alive using technology inside a jar, as if he were a trophy or just some other specimen in a lab. I love this, because it combines elements of body horror and dark comedy to deliver the perfect fate for a villain who spent his life treating people like lab specimens, only to end up becoming one himself. In the end, despite his pursuit of making himself stronger and better through self-experimentation, he only ended up becoming a pickled head in a jar. I feel that his character is a perfect cautionary tale about hubris and the dangers of how even the noblest pursuits, if not kept in check, can become something dangerous and diabolical. Hank McCoy was eventually consumed by his passions and truly transformed into a beast, body, mind, and soul, due to having no fetters on his desires and morality. When you look at his Earth-616 version, the darkness and Dark Beast becomes even more evident, in my opinion. The lesson that I take away from his character is that every one of us has a beast inside, and we are also just one bad day away from going down the same road as Hank McCoy, aka Dark Beast. What are your opinions on the character of Dark Beast? Let me know in the comments down below. For now though, it's time for me to say goodbye. I hope to see you again in the next one. Until then, stay safe